In the early months of the Second Boer War, the British Empire, vast, industrial and supremely confident, was about to face humiliation at the hands of farmer soldiers. Yet, on a windy ridge outside a small railway station called Elandslaagte, 3,500 British soldiers would reverse that narrative. Their stand would become one of the most dramatic moments of 1899, a victory pulled from what looked like certain disaster. The Boer War had begun badly for Britain. Commandos, small, mobile, and fiercely accurate with their German-made Mauser rifles, had crossed the frontiers with startling speed. Within days they'd seized key towns, cut telegraph lines, and surrounded isolated garrisons. Newspapers back in London were already asking whether the Empire's army had gone soft. Against that backdrop, the story of Elandslaagte became a badly needed legend. Proof that British discipline, organization, and firepower could still triumph against odds. But this battle was never just about military glory. It was about adaptation, how an army raised on parade ground drill had to learn modern warfare in real time. It was about human endurance, where men who joined the colors for steady pay suddenly faced the full brutality of industrial-age combat. And above all, it was about leadership under pressure, the moment when a cautious general and an audacious subordinate gambled everything on a single assault. On the 21st of October, 1899, the weather over northern Natal was deceptive. The sky was clear, the air cool, the kind of morning that promised calm. Yet by dusk, that same calm would give way to the roar of artillery, the rattle of rifle fire, and the screams of the wounded across the veldt. Outnumbered, exposed, and facing entrenched marksmen on commanding ground, British troops advanced into a storm of bullets and somehow kept going. The ridge east of the railway station looked unremarkable, a low, rocky rise broken by scrub and stone. But it was the key to the region's rail lifeline. Whoever held it could choke off supplies and reinforcements to the besieged town of Ladysmith to the south. For General Sir George White, that could not be allowed. He needed to strike fast, clear the position, and remind both his men and the enemy that British steel still mattered. Command of the operation went to Major General John French, a restless cavalryman whose aggressive instincts clashed with the caution of his seniors. French was bold, pragmatic, and unafraid of risk. He believed in combined arms, artillery to suppress, infantry to storm, and cavalry to exploit. What he devised at Elandslaagte was textbook in design but daring in execution. A coordinated assault by 3,500 men against nearly 1,000 entrenched Boers on high ground. The coming hours would test every assumption about British warfare. Could drilled infantry cross open ground under modern rifle fire? Could cavalry still matter in an age of smokeless powder? Could command and control survive the chaos of long-range shooting and invisible enemies? The answers would come at a terrible price. Elandslaagte would become a proving ground for a new century's wars, a small, savage battle that foreshadowed everything the world would later learn about courage, technology, and the cost of command. Long before the guns opened at Elandslaagte, the ground for war had been laid by gold, pride, and politics. South Africa in the late 19th century was a mosaic of power. British colonies at the coast and Boer republics inland. The discovery of diamonds at Kimberley and gold on the Witwatersrand transformed those republics into some of the richest territories on earth, and made them irresistible to an empire hungry for resources and control. To the British, the Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, were backward, isolationist, and inconvenient. To the Boers, they were the last outposts of independence in a world being consumed by imperial ambition. The collision was inevitable. At the heart of the tension stood President Paul Kruger, the aging patriarch of the Transvaal. Canny, stubborn, and deeply religious, Kruger saw through British diplomacy with the clarity of a man who had fought too many wars to be fooled again. Opposite him stood Alfred Milner, Britain's High Commissioner, an imperial idealist who viewed Boer independence as an obstacle to civilization. To Milner, annexation was not a question of if, but when. The pretext came in the form of the Highlanders, foreign workers, mostly British, who flocked to the Transvaal's gold mines. Milner claimed they were denied political rights and mistreated, a narrative eagerly amplified by London newspapers. In reality, the issue was control. Whoever ruled Johannesburg's mines ruled South Africa's future. By 1899, tension had reached breaking point. The Boers, outnumbered but fiercely independent, watched British troops mass along their borders. On October 11th, Kruger's government delivered an ultimatum: withdraw your forces within 48 hours or face war. It was a desperate bluff, or so London thought. When the ultimatum expired, the Boers struck first. Commandos on horseback crossed the borders by night, moving with breathtaking speed. Telegraph lines were cut, railways sabotaged, British garrisons overwhelmed. In a matter of days, colonial complacency turned to alarm. The Empire's professional army, trained for parade ground warfare, found itself ambushed by farmers who could shoot the eye out of a springbok at 300 yards. In Natal, the key northern province, the Boers pushed toward Ladysmith, threatening to cut British control in half. Local commanders fell back in confusion. But for all the setbacks, General Sir George White, newly arrived from India, refused to yield. He understood that losing Ladysmith would mean losing the campaign. To regain momentum, he needed a victory, any victory. Reports soon arrived. A Boer force had occupied Elandslaagte station, a vital node on the railway north of Ladysmith. The ridge above it bristled with trenches. From there, the Boers could raid supply lines at will. White saw his chance. If he could smash that detachment, he could buy breathing room for the defense of Ladysmith and restore British morale. What followed was not simply a tactical decision, it was an act of psychological warfare. The British Army needed to prove to itself that it could win, and Elandslaagte, a nameless dot on the map, would become the place where that proof was written in blood. At Ladysmith's field headquarters, tension hung as heavy as the midday heat. General Sir George White, 64 years old and schooled in the wars of empire, understood the burden of command. He had led men from Afghanistan to Burma and India's northwest frontier, earning his Victoria Cross decades earlier for charging into chaos. Yet nothing in his career had prepared him for the fast, fluid warfare now sweeping across Natal. The Boers were not the kind of enemy his manuals described. They had no fixed formations, no predictable front lines, no brightly colored uniforms to mark them out. They appeared, struck, and vanished, hitting telegraphs, trains, and outposts with uncanny precision. White's reports from the front were grim. British columns harried, communications severed, morale fraying. Then came the message that changed everything. Scouts confirmed that a Boer commando of roughly 900 to 1,000 men, under the command of a German-trained officer, had dug in near Elandslaagte station, just 15 miles north. Their trenches commanded the railway, the artery feeding Ladysmith's defenders. If left unchecked, the Boers could cut the line, isolate the garrison, and doom White's entire command. White studied his maps and weighed his options. He could retreat, fortify, and wait for reinforcements from the coast. But retreat meant ceding the initiative and inviting siege. He could ignore the threat, but that risked strangling his supply chain. Or he could attack, risking men and reputation to seize back control. He chose to strike. For the task, he needed a commander who believed in movement, aggression, and audacity, qualities often discouraged in the rigid Victorian hierarchy. That man was Major General John Denton Pinkstone French, a cavalry officer whose energy bordered on reckless brilliance. French had served in the Sudan and understood speed, coordination, and surprise. He was new to South Africa, but already restless, impatient with the cautious pace of his superiors. When White summoned him on the evening of October 20th, the meeting was brisk. The orders were clear. March north at dawn, engage the enemy at Elandslaagte, and drive them from their position before they could be reinforced. French accepted immediately. For him, this was more than an assignment. It was a chance to vindicate his belief that mobility, not caution, would win the war. He assembled a mixed force of about 3,500 men, infantry from the Manchester Regiment, the Devonshire Regiment, and the Gordon Highlanders, cavalry from the 5th Lancers and Imperial Light Horse, and a powerful artillery contingent, including naval guns, dragged inland from the coast. Supporting them were engineers, medical units, and supply wagons stretching for miles, a small but complete expeditionary column. That night, in the flicker of lamplight, French and his staff pored over maps. His plan was deceptively simple. Advance at dawn along the railway, deploy artillery to pound the ridge, then send infantry forward in two coordinated columns, one attacking from the south, the other from the north. Once the Boers broke, his cavalry would ride them down. It was textbook strategy, but war rarely obeys textbooks. What French couldn't yet know was that the ground ahead, open, exposed, and swept by enemy rifles, would test every ounce of discipline in his ranks. By dawn, the column was ready to move. Men shouldered packs and rifles. Horses were saddled, guns limbered. In the cool stillness of the Natal morning, French mounted his horse and gave the quiet order to advance. The long march to Elandslaagte had begun. The force that marched out of Ladysmith that October morning was a microcosm of the British Empire, an army of regions, accents and experiences bound by one flag. Each regiment brought its own traditions, character, and fighting spirit. At its core were the infantry, the enduring backbone of any British field army. The Manchester Regiment, drawn from industrial northern towns, embodied the working-class soldier's grit, steady, pragmatic, and unflinching under fire. Alongside them, the Devonshire Regiment represented rural steadiness and discipline, men accustomed to hard labour and long marches. Completing the trio stood the Gordon Highlanders, the pride of Scotland, whose kilts and pipes symbolized both tradition and ferocity. They carried reputations forged at Waterloo in India and across the Empire's endless frontiers. Supporting the infantry came the artillery, the voice of modern war. French's column included field batteries of 15-pounder guns capable of rapid fire and precise targeting, and heavier 12-pounder naval guns improvised onto wheeled carriages. They were crewed by professional gunners who understood the delicate arithmetic of range, fuse timing, and trajectory. For all their mechanical precision, these men knew that artillery was as much art as science, especially when your own infantry had to advance into the smoke you created. Then came the cavalry, the 5th Lancers, the Empire's old-school warriors, and the Imperial Light Horse, colonial volunteers who rode like Boers and fought like professionals. The Lancers' 9-foot spears looked anachronistic in an age of smokeless powder, but their spirit remained medieval, aggressive, proud, and trained for shock action. The Light Horse, meanwhile, represented the frontier, settlers, miners and hunters who knew the terrain, the weather and the enemy's tricks. Every regiment, every gun, every horse had its role, and behind the fighters moved the invisible lifeline of war: supply wagons, ammunition carts, medical teams, engineers with spades and wire cutters, signalers carrying heliographs and flags. The column stretched across the veldt in a sinuous line of men, animals, and wheels, disciplined chaos moving north. French's plan was direct, yet flexible. Once within range, his artillery would deploy on open ground south and west of the ridge, hammering the Boer trenches and gun emplacements. The infantry would advance in two columns: Hamilton's southern group, Devon's and Imperial Light Horse, and Cunningham's northern attack, Gordon's and Manchester's. The cavalry would hold back until the moment of decision, ready to exploit any breakthrough. It was a plan born of pragmatism and audacity. Overwhelm a numerically smaller but well-entrenched enemy through synchronization and sheer momentum. Success required timing, communication, and nerve. As the first wheels rolled over the dusty track, the rising sun caught the brass buttons and rifle barrels of the marching soldiers. They were heading toward one of the defining tests of the early war, where the old world of red-coated heroics would collide with the deadly precision of modern firepower. The column moved out before dawn. The sky was pale, the air crisp, and for a few fleeting minutes war felt almost peaceful. Men trudged in silence at first, adjusting packs, checking straps, listening to the creak of leather and the rhythmic clop of hooves. Ahead lay 15 miles of grassland and the ridge that would decide their fate. The march was a test of endurance. Wool uniforms clung to sweat as the sun climbed higher, turning the Natal spring into an oven. Dust-coated faces and rifles alike. Officers rode along the flanks, ensuring pace and order, while sergeants barked reminders. Keep interval. Check water. Small errors, an empty canteen, a broken strap, could cost a life before the first shot was fired. Within each company, conversation flickered like sparks. Some joked about home, others speculated about what awaited them. Private Thomas Jenkins, 19 years old from Lancashire, felt the weight of both his rifle and his thoughts. He'd joined to escape the mines, not expecting to meet death on a South African hillside. Yet here he was, marching toward gunfire he couldn't yet hear. By mid-morning, cavalry scouts rode back with reports. Boer pickets sighted ahead, entrenched on high ground near the railway. French called a halt. Men dropped packs, grateful for a few moments' rest. The general and his staff rode forward to reconnoiter. From a small rise, French raised his binoculars and studied the field. The Boer position dominated everything, a long ridge running north to south, lined with rocks and earthworks. He could see trenches, rifle pits, and flashes of sunlight off metal. The defenders had picked their ground perfectly. Any frontal attack would mean crossing open land under the muzzles of expert marksmen. French considered alternatives. There were none easy. He would have to fight uphill into fire. But he also saw opportunities. The ridge was long, the defenders stretched thin, and his guns outnumbered theirs 10-1. If he hit both flanks at once and kept them under relentless bombardment, he could split their line before they knew what was happening. Behind him, men filled canteens, checked sights, and watched distant figures move along the ridge. The calm before combat was its own kind of torture. Every soldier knew the stillness would not last. When the order came to advance, they formed up in long, staggered lines, the railway their guide. The veldt stretched ahead, golden and deceptive, beautiful and deadly. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the first bullets of the day were waiting. Elandslaagte was no longer a name on a map. It was a destination, a challenge, and within hours, it would become a legend. By noon, French's reconnaissance confirmed the worst. The Boers held a textbook defensive position. Their trenches zigzagged along the crest of the ridge, and behind them, hidden in folds of ground, were two artillery pieces, German-made, precise, and deadly. From that vantage they could rake any approach. But war favors the adaptable, and French was nothing if not pragmatic. Standing beside his officers, he marked positions in the dirt with his riding crop, sketching his revised plan. His guns would take up position on a broad plain west of the ridge. Once they opened fire, the infantry would advance in two thrusts, Hamilton from the south, Cunningham from the north. The cavalry would remain in reserve, ready to sweep the field once the defenders broke. He knew what this meant. His men would have to cross 1,500 yards of open veldt under sustained rifle fire. It was a deadly prospect, but delay was worse. Every hour risked Boer reinforcements from the main army pressing toward Ladysmith. The ridge itself was unremarkable to the eye, but treacherous to the soldier. Between the railway and the Boer trenches lay grass, broken by shallow hollows. Dead ground, where men could shelter between bursts of fire. Those folds would become lifelines. As French finalized his orders, his subordinates made final checks. Ammunition was distributed, water bottles filled. Each battalion commander gathered his men and explained the plan in plain language. Advance steadily. Use cover. Trust your training. Far across the field, Boer Commander General Koch watched through his own glass. A veteran of Europe's Prussian school, he had dug deep, fortified well, and expected the British to break themselves on his walls of rock and dirt. Yet even he felt a flicker of unease as the sun caught the flash of British gun carriages wheeling into position. For the next hour, the veldt was silent, save for the shifting of horses and the metallic clatter of shells being loaded. The tension was physical, pressing down like the humid air. At 12:45 p.m., French lowered his binoculars. Open fire. The silence shattered. 24 British guns erupted almost in unison, their recoil jolting the earth. The air filled with the scream of shells arcing toward the ridge, followed by explosions that tore rock, dirt, and smoke into the sky. The bombardment rolled like thunder, echoing for miles. Soldiers who had never heard artillery before felt it in their chests more than their ears. The Boers ducked into trenches as shrapnel and stone rained down. For all their courage, they had never faced such concentrated firepower. Each shell burst with a metallic shriek, spraying fragments that cut down anyone caught in the open. Their own guns replied, just 2 or 3 pieces, but their accuracy was uncanny. A British field gun was struck and silenced, its crew shredded where they stood. Still, the imbalance was overwhelming. For an hour, the ridge disappeared behind a curtain of dust and smoke. Gunners swabbed, reloaded, and fired again, each round walking closer to the Boer positions. The rhythm became mechanical. Load, aim, fire, repeat. Officers adjusted elevation through haze so thick it blurred the line between earth and sky. For the men watching, time distorted. Minutes felt like hours. The noise was ceaseless, a rolling thunder punctuated by the whine of fragments and the distant crack of rifles. Even miles away, townsfolk heard it and knew a great battle was underway. At 2 p.m., the order came down the line. Prepare to advance. The bombardment shifted higher up the ridge, laying a lifting fire to mask the infantry's movement. It was the moment of truth. The guns fell briefly silent. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise. Across the field, thousands of soldiers took a deep breath, fixed bayonets, and waited for the signal. Then came the bugle. The British lines surged forward into history. On the right, the Gordon Highlanders and Manchester Regiment advanced across the plain, rifles low, bayonets glinting. On the left, the Devons and Imperial Light Horse moved toward the ridge's southern flank. Each man spaced several yards apart, keeping formation through shouts and signals. The first volley from the Boer trenches was like a single tearing sound, hundreds of Mauser rifles firing as one. Bullets hissed and snapped through the grass, invisible and lethal. Men fell in the first 100 yards, some silently, others crying out. But the advance did not stop. The veterans led by example. Colonel Cunningham rode calmly among the Highlanders, his kilted men firing by sections, leapfrogging forward. The younger officers shouted themselves hoarse, urging their companies on. Private Jenkins of the Manchesters stumbled over a body and kept running, his breath ragged, ears ringing. On the left, Colonel Ian Hamilton realized his attack was stalling under deadly crossfire. Thinking fast, he dispatched scouts to find a covered approach. They discovered a dry gully, narrow, winding and unseen from the ridge. Hamilton diverted his men through it, turning the flank while the Imperial Light Horse led the way, crawling, climbing, inching forward unseen. For nearly an hour, the battle hung in balance. Every yard was paid for in blood, yet discipline held. Fire and movement carried the line closer, 200 yards, 800, 600. At 300 yards, Colonel Cunningham saw the moment had come. He stood, sword raised, and gave the immortal order. Fix bayonets. Metal clicked onto rifle muzzles in a rippling wave. Then came the skirl of bagpipes. The Highlanders rose from the grass and charged, kilts flying, pipes wailing through the smoke. The sight was unreal, ancient ritual meeting industrial war. The Boers fired desperately, but the momentum was unstoppable. At 50 yards, their fire faltered. At 25, panic rippled through their line. Then steel met flesh. What followed was chaos. The British stormed the trenches in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets, rifle butts, and fists replaced volleys. Some Boers surrendered, others fought to the last. The air reeked of cordite, sweat, and blood. When it ended, the ridge was British. Hamilton's men erupted from the gully to seize the southern flank, completing the envelopment. The Boers broke, running for their horses and retreating north. The battle had turned, but French was not finished. The moment the Boers began to run, French seized his chance. Turning to his cavalry commander, Colonel Scott Moncrief, he issued the words every horseman longed to hear. Charge. 505th Lancers thundered across the field, lances lowered, pennons fluttering. It was a vision from another century, steel and horseflesh surging into the smoke of modern war. The ground trembled beneath them. Ahead, the fleeing Boers looked back in horror. Some tried to form up and fire, others scattered. It made little difference. The impact was devastating. Lances pierced, sabers slashed, men and horses collided in a blur of dust and blood. In less than 15 minutes, the pursuit stretched for miles across the veldt. The discipline of parade gave way to the frenzy of combat. Critics later called it slaughter. Supporters called it justice. Either way, it ended the battle. By dusk, the ridge and the station were firmly in British hands. Boer Commander General Koch lay mortally wounded, one of over 200 dead. British losses were similar in number, but the psychological reversal was complete. As darkness fell, lanterns flickered among the wounded. Doctors and orderlies worked through the night, binding, cutting, and comforting. Officers walked among the fallen, unable to tell friend from foe in the gloom. War, stripped of glory, revealed its true face. At dawn the next day, the battlefield was silent, but for the groans of the wounded and the distant cry of scavenger birds. Elandslaagte was a victory, tactically flawless, emotionally cathartic, and yet strategically hollow. French's triumph should have opened the road north, possibly relieving Ladysmith before the siege tightened. Instead, General White, wary of overextension, ordered a withdrawal back to town. Within days, Boer reinforcements reoccupied the station. The line was lost, and the siege began. For the soldiers who fought there, that retreat was bitter. They had bled for the ridge, buried friends under